Good afternoon. My pleasure this afternoon is to introduce Kendra Marderosian, who is one of NASBAR's strategic partners. We are delighted to have her. This afternoon, I've asked her to come and talk a little bit about, and this is an unfortunate circumstance, but what happens when one of the parties to a real estate transaction passes away?
Right. Well, I think one of the key things to remember here is it's a real estate transaction, which is a little bit more unique than your traditional contract. We're talking about someone's home. So it's not just a commercial deal, it's not the sale of a business. There are emotions involved, and the asset itself, the home, is very personal to both parties. So I think the best way to look at this is to look at it from a legal perspective and then also take into account kind of a real world scenario of how this usually works. Strictly speaking from a legal perspective, and if we're using the 7.0 multi-state contract, there is nothing in the 7.0 contract that makes that contract transferable to the heirs of one of the parties. So in that instance, if let's just use the seller as an example. Let's say the seller passes away. The heirs of the seller are not automatically required to step into the role of the seller in that contract. There is a concept out there, a legal concept called impossibility. It's a defense to a claim of a breach of contract. So if you have a seller who passes away, it's, in my opinion, the defense of impossibility would come into play. What the defense of impossibility states is not, I can't do the contract, but the thing cannot be done. The contract cannot be completed. And if you have a seller who passes away and there's nothing in the contract that indicates that the heirs have to step into the role of the seller, which again the 7.0 does not have that, we're looking at a scenario where, in my opinion, legally that contract is impossible. The seller is not there, so the thing can't be done. The seller cannot come to the table to sign the closing documents. That's the legal perspective. More of a real life perspective is, again, it's somebody's home. So there may be a workaround behind just a strict, okay, someone passed away, we're going to cancel this contract. And I think a good way to look at that is to break it down between buyer and seller. So let's say a seller passes away. In that instance, we're immediately going to have to look at time and estate planning. Time in the sense that if someone passes away, there's going to be a delay of the closing of some sort. So do the parties have the time, to deal with whatever that delay is going to be? There would need to be presented to the title company a death certificate for sure. So again, there's going to be a little bit of a lag with that. But if the seller's family is still willing to go forward, the other consideration is what type of estate plan documents did the seller have in place? If the seller died without a will, or the seller had just a simple will, whoever is going to be appointed as the individual acting on behalf of the estate would have to go to court, and there would have to be specific documentation in place from the court that would allow that person to act on behalf of the seller. If the seller had an estate plan that included a trust, and the house was actually in a trust, deeded to a trust at the time of the seller's death, then the successor trustee could step right into the role of seller and complete the contract that way. Now, if we're dealing with a buyer, it can become it's a little bit more complicated to talk about. I think that we have to consider things like who is the buyer, how many of them are there, and are they able to move forward? So if you have a situation with a family and the buyers are a husband and a wife, and the individual who passes away happened to be the biggest financial contributor to the family, you have considerations such as, can they go through with the loan? Are they going to still get their loan approval? Does the family still want the house? Are they going to be able to afford the house? Those sort of considerations. So, but just to kind of go through it, if it were an individual buyer and the buyer passed away and they had some kind of relative or someone else in their family that wanted still to purchase this house, in that instance, another buyer could simply step in. And again, I'm talking about, the simplest of scenarios where maybe it's a cash deal or something like that, where we don't have all these other factors coming into play. But really, a buyer could step in if, the seller is agreeable to that, and the closing could proceed in that way.
All right. Thank you, Kendra. That's really interesting. I know it's a question I get a lot when I'm doing classes. Thank you.